the bond's intrinsic value. It was a textbook Graham and Dodd setup, the mother of all value investments. United, the largest EETC issuer, stayed in bankruptcy for over 3 years, during which I scrambled to become an airline and aircraft expert. Until then, my knowledge of the industry consisted of buying a ticket, preferably in business class. By the time United emerged from its bankruptcy, Northwest and Delta were getting ready to file and provide new investment opportunities. Aircraft and airline bonds had developed into a profitable mainstay of our fund, and I had become a portfolio manager. Now, it will come as a shock to my admirers, but I've had lousy investments in my days. A good many could have been avoided with a careful rereading of security analysis. One is particularly searing. Years after my first airline investment, I sought to expand my success in airlines to shipping, both transportation businesses with a high fixed cost structure and volatile input, fuel, supported by long-life assets that can be traded worldwide, and first mortgage debt that could sometimes be purchased at a discount. How different could it be? Not at all, it turned out, except for the minus instead of the plus sign in front of my return. Financiers of ships do not benefit from the same ability to seize their collateral upon a default or bankruptcy. First, it is exceedingly difficult to arrest a vessel. Second, even first lien debt is subordinated to maritime liens such as crew wages or unpaid freight, fuel, or port charges. In other words, you lack the positive and substantial advantage of the realizability of the pledged assets. Last, shipping commands no customer loyalty, no brand value, or corporate differentiation, hair-raisingly volatile rates, and low geographic arbitrage availability. You can repossess a plane from a distressed U.S. carrier and sell it to a thriving Brazilian domestic airline for a profitable route. Not so in shipping. It would have been handy to realize in 2013 when I invested in Eagle Bulk Shipping that the conception of a mortgage lien as a guarantee of protection independent of the success of the business itself is, in most cases, a complete fallacy. Yet, Eagle Bulk started as a successful restructuring, smoothly navigating through the bankruptcy process, dare I say, sailing, with the support of lenders, including yours truly. Business continued uninterrupted, new financing was obtained, obligations to customers and employees were fulfilled, and the company emerged within 6 months with a brand spanking new capital structure and bright business prospects. Within months, shipping rates plummeted, and even the restructured first lien blew up. The illiquidity of the loan exacerbated the drop in price. The mortgaged assets provided no floor value. Safety is not measured by lien, but by the ability to pay, was the lesson. The proverbial eagle had landed, but it was an emergency descent into distressed land again. A lot has muddled the craft of distressed investing since my EETC encounter and shipping debacle. In chronological order, I would cite 3 seismic shifts. The first is that investing in distressed debt has become mainstream and institutionalized since the telecom crisis of 2001. Back then, the Callan periodic tables estimated distressed hedge funds at $24 billion in assets under management and multi-strategy hedge funds at $66 billion. While it would be arduous to circle a total number because most funds straddle multiple strategies, the largest 25 distressed players alone managed around $600 billion in 2022. Restructurings are increasingly imposed by and designed to maximize recovery for the mega funds. Anyone else, vendor, junior creditor, labor, is, as Iggy Pop used to say, a passenger who rides and who rides. Creditor on creditor violence is real, or as one expressive lawyer put it, the cannibalistic assault by one group of lenders in a syndicate against another. Is the laudable goal of Chapter 11 to maximize the value of the debtor for all creditors and distribute it fairly and equitably, let alone amicably, ancient history? I don't believe so. It's worth noting that distressed investing is not graveyard dancing. It's rebuilding, which is in the best interest of all constituencies. Through a capital restructuring or an operational turnaround, or most likely both, a company can become viable again, with employees and vendors paid on time and growth prospects supported by sustainable financing sources. The second tsunami is the Federal Reserve's intervention in the capital markets, including corporate debt. This is a new phenomenon that neither the value investing creators nor the Chicago School academics envisioned. After all, quantitative easing, QE, was introduced in the United States only in 2008. It made sense then. The Great Financial Recession was a liquidity and solvency crisis. How do you combat it? By injecting liquidity. Subsequent crises were neither, yet the Fed has used more versions of QE than there are sequels of The Matrix. QE 1, 2, 3, and 4, and Operation Twist between 2008 and 2014. As a result of the COVID-19 crisis, it deployed an even greater reaching program, dipping its toes into purchasing high-yield bonds. One of many direct results is that episodes of debt dislocation have dramatically shortened, and supply of distressed bonds has become disappointingly shallow. While the peak-to-trough distressed bout persisted for over a year during the global financial crisis and the telecom crisis, it shortened to barely 3 months through the taper tantrum of 2013, the energy price crunch of 2016, and the pandemic catastrophe of 2020. Simply put, the Fed has learned to act fast, wide, and decisively. It's the Grinch who stole distressed. The third revolution comes from mass retail online investing, an interesting phenomenon in the lenses of both value investing and efficient market theories. Our neoclassical investors probably wouldn't classify the actions of Robinhood, Reddit, or Wall Street Bets users as investing, because I doubt Graham would define reading a tweet as thorough analysis. But whether you call it speculation, gamification of stocks, or democratization of trading, it has become a critical market force with deep and sometimes lasting consequences, capable of bringing a large institutional fund to its knees and driving a large bankruptcy process to a specific outcome. It is well beyond the temporary yo-yo moves on meme stocks and stonks. Ask Melvin Capital, the $12.5 billion hedge fund that required a capital infusion rescue after a devastating loss inflicted by the whiplash on GameStop and was still shut down a few months later. Or look at Hertz, where 2 successive restructuring plans initially left the equity for dead. A pop in the stock, unexplainable but for retail gambling and penny stocks, led first to a failed equity raise, then to a legal objection against restructuring plans that wiped out the equity, and finally to a 36-hour bidding auction that ascribed meaningful recovery to pre-bankruptcy equity holders. Maybe the phenomenon is mere senseless mob speculation, but maybe if we want to use the Graham and Dodd framework, the intrinsic value of some securities exceeds their economic utility because they deliver something more: entertainment value and membership in a community of holders. And maybe Markowitz and Sharp would posit that this community holds a tool that is illegal for institutional investors, unfathomable until the era of social media, and antithetical to the efficient market hypothesis, the ability to act as a group. From these developments, we would conclude that the imperative for distressed investing is to be as big as an elephant, quick as a bunny, and clever as a roaring kitty. In other words, it's complicated. To the young and impetuous distressed investors of tomorrow, I say, fear not, for the answers are here, in the wise prose of Graham and Dodd. First, the capital advice, disregarded by many, an esteemed colleague over the years, yet reliably valuable in my experience. We ought, as far as possible, to know what we are talking about. Second, if all else fails, remember this. As the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard noted, life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. Chapter 22. Privileged Issues. We come now to the second major division of our revised classification of securities, viz., bonds and preferred stocks presumed by the buyer to be subject to substantial change in principal value. In our introductory discussion, Chapter 5, we subdivided this group under two heads: those issues which are speculative because of inadequate safety, and those which are speculative because they possess a conversion or similar privilege which makes possible substantial variations in market price. Senior issues with speculative privileges. In addition to enjoying a prior claim for a fixed amount of principal and income, a bond or preferred stock may also be given the right to share in benefits accruing to the common stock. These privileges are of three kinds, designated as follows. 1. Convertible, conferring the right to exchange the senior issue for common stock on stipulated terms. 2. Participating, under which additional income may be paid to the senior security holder, dependent usually upon the amount of common dividends declared. 3. Subscription, by which holders of the bond or preferred stock may purchase common shares at prices, in amounts, and during periods stipulated. Since the conversion privilege is the most familiar of the three, we shall frequently use the term convertible issues to refer to privileged issues in general. Such issues attractive in form. By means of any one of these three provisions, a senior security can be given virtually all the profit possibilities that attach to the common stock of the enterprise. Such issues must therefore be considered as the most attractive of all in point of form, since they permit the combination of maximum safety with the chance of unlimited appreciation in value. A bond that meets all the requirements of a sound investment and, in addition, possess an interesting conversion privilege would undoubtedly constitute a highly desirable purchase. Their investment record unenviable. Reasons. Despite this impressive argument in favor of privileged senior issues as a form of investment, we must recognize that actual experience with this class has not been generally satisfactory. For this discrepancy between promise and performance, reasons of two different kinds may be advanced. The first is that only a small fraction of the privileged issues have actually met the rigorous requirements of a sound investment. The conversion feature has most often been offered to compensate for inadequate security. This weakness was most pronounced during the period of greatest vogue for convertible issues between 1926 and 1929. During these years, it was broadly true that the strongly entrenched industrial enterprises raised money through sales of common stock, whereas the weaker or weakly capitalized undertakings resorted to privileged senior securities. The second reason is related to the conditions under which profit may accrue from the conversion privilege. Although there is indeed no upper limit to the price that a convertible bond may reach, there is a very real limitation on the amount of profit that the holder may realize while still maintaining an investment position. After a privileged issue has advanced with the common stock, its price soon becomes dependent in both directions upon changes in the stock quotation, and to that extent the continued holding of the senior issue becomes a speculative operation. An example will make this clear. Let us assume the purchase of a high-grade 3.5% bond at par, convertible into 2 shares of common for each $100 bond, that is, convertible into common stock at 50. The common stock is selling at 45 when the bond is bought. First stage. 1. If the stock declines to 35, the bond may remain close to par. This illustrates the pronounced technical advantage of a convertible issue over the common stock. 2. If the stock advances to 55, the price of the bond will probably rise to 115 or more. Its immediate conversion value would be 110, but a premium would be justified because of its advantage over the stock. This illustrates the undoubted speculative possibilities of such a convertible issue. Second stage. The stock advances further to 65. The conversion value of the bond is now 130, and it will sell at that figure or slightly higher. At this point, the original purchaser is faced with a problem. Within wide limits, the future price of his bond depends entirely upon the course of the common stock. In order to seek a larger profit, he must risk the loss of the profit in hand, which in fact constitutes a substantial part of the present market value of his security. A drop in the price of the common could readily induce a decline in the bond from 130 to 110. If he elects to hold the issue, he places himself to a considerable degree in the position of the stockholders, and this similarity increases rapidly as the price advances further. If, for example, he is still holding the bond at a level, say, of 180, 90 for the stock, he has, for all practical purposes, assumed the status and risks of a stockholder. Unlimited profit in such issues identified with stockholders' position. The unlimited profit possibilities of a privileged issue are thus, in an important sense, illusory. They must be identified not with the ownership of a bond or preferred stock, but with the assumption of a common stockholder's position, which any holder of a non-convertible may effect by exchanging his bond for a stock. Practically speaking, the range of profit possibilities for a convertible issue, although still maintaining the advantage of an investment holding, must usually be limited to somewhere between 25 and 35% of its face value. For this reason, original purchasers of privileged issues do not ordinarily hold them for more than a small fraction of the maximum market gains scored by the most successful among them, and consequently they do not actually realize these very large possible profits. Thus, the profits taken may not offset the losses occasioned by unsound commitments in this field. Examples of attractive issues. The two objections just discussed must considerably temper our enthusiasm for privileged senior issues as a class, but they by no means destroy their inherent advantages nor the possibilities of exploiting them with reasonable success. Although most new convertible offerings may have been inadequately secured, there are fairly frequent exceptions to the rule, and these exceptions should be of prime interest to the alert investor. We append three leading examples of such opportunities taken from the utility, the railroad, and the industrial fields. 1. Commonwealth Edison Company Convertible Debenture 3.5s, due 1958. These bonds were offered to shareholders in June and September 1938 at par. The statistical exhibit of the company gave every assurance that the debentures were a sound commitment at that price. They were convertible into 40 shares of common stock until maturity or prior redemption. In September 1938, the debentures could have been bought on the New York Stock Exchange at par when the stock was selling at 24.5. At these prices, the bonds and stock were selling very close to a parity, and a slight advance in the price of the stock would enable the holder of the bond to sell at a profit. Less than a year later, July 1939, the stock had risen to 31 3/8 and the bonds to 124 3/4. 2. Chesapeake and Ohio Railway Company Convertible 5s, due 1946. These bonds were originally offered to shareholders in June 1916. They were convertible into common stock at 75 until April 1, 1920, at 80 from the latter date until April 1, 1923, at 90 from the latter date until April 1, 1926, and at 100 from the latter date until April 1, 1936. Late in 1924, they could have been bought on a parity basis, that is, without payment of a premium for the conversion privilege, at prices close to par. Specifically, they sold on November 28, 1924 at 101 when the stock sold at 91. At that time, the company's earnings were showing continued improvement and indicated that the bonds were adequately secured. Fixed charges were covered twice in 1924. The value of the conversion privilege was shown by the fact that the stock sold at 131 in the next year, making the bonds worth 145. 3. Rand Cardex Bureau, Inc., 5.5s, due 1931. These bonds were originally offered in December 1925 at 99.5. They carried stock purchase warrants, detachable after January 1st, 1927, entitling the holder to purchase 22.5 shares of Class A common at $40 per share during 1926, at $42.50 per share during 1927, at $45 per share during 1928, at $47.50 per share during 1929, and at $50 per share during 1930. The Class A stock was in reality a participating preferred issue. The bonds could be turned in at par at payment for the stock purchased under the warrants, a provision that virtually made the bonds convertible into the stock. The bonds appeared to be adequately secured. The previous exhibit, based on the earnings of the predecessor companies, showed the following coverage for the interest on the new bond issue. Year 1921, Depression year. Number of times interest covered, 1.7. 1922, Depression year. Number of times interest covered, 2.3. 1923, number of times interest covered, 6.7. 1924, number of times interest covered, 7.2. 1925, 9 months, number of times interest covered, 12.2. Net current assets exceed twice the face value of the bond issue. When the bonds were offered to the public, the Class A stock was quoted at about 42, indicating an immediate value for the stock purchase warrants. The following year, the stock advanced to 53 and the bonds to 130.5. In 1927, when Rand Cardex merged with Remington Typewriter, the stock advanced to 76 and the bonds to 190. Example of an unattractive issue. By way of contrast with these examples, we shall supply an illustration of a superficially attractive but basically unsound convertible offering, such as characterized the 1928 to 1929 period. National Trade Journals, Inc. 6% convertible notes due 1938. The company was organized in February 1928 to acquire and publish about a dozen trade journals. In November 1928, it sold $2,800,000 of the foregoing notes at 97.5. The notes were initially convertible into 27 shares of common stock at $37.03 per share until November 1, 1930, into 25 shares at $40 a share from the latter date until November 1, 1932, and at prices that progressively increased to $52.63 a share during the last 2 years of the life of the bonds. These bonds could have been purchased at the time of issuance and for several months thereafter at prices only slightly above their parity value as compared with the market value of the equivalent stock. Specifically, they could have been bought at 97.5 on November 30th when the stock sold at 34 1/8. Which meant that the stock needed to advance only 2 points to assure a profit on conversion. However, at no time did the bonds appear to be adequately secured, despite the attractive picture presented in the offering circular. The circular exhibited estimated earnings of the predecessor enterprise based on the 3.5 years preceding, which averaged 4.16 times the charges on the bond issue. But close to half of these estimated earnings were expected to be derived from economies predicted to result from the consolidation in the way of reduction of salaries, etc. The conservative investor would not be justified in taking these earnings for granted, particularly in a hazardous and competitive business of this type, with a relatively small amount of tangible assets. Eliminating the estimated earnings mentioned in the preceding paragraph, the exhibit at the time of issuance and thereafter may be seen in the chart found in the accompanying PDF. Receivers were appointed in June 1931. The properties were sold in August of that year, and bondholders later received about 8.5 cents on the dollar. Principal derived. From these contrasting instances, an investment principle may be developed that should afford a valuable guide to the selection of privileged senior issues. The principle is as follows. A privileged senior issue selling close to or above face value must meet the requirements either of a straight fixed value investment or of a straight common stock speculation, and it must be bought with one or the other qualification clearly in view. The alternative given supplies two different approaches to the purchase of a privileged security. It may be bought as a sound investment with an incidental chance of profit through an enhancement of principal, or it may be bought primarily as an attractive form of speculation in the common stock. Generally speaking, there should be no middle ground. The investor interested in safety of principal should not abate his requirements in return for a conversion privilege. The speculator should not be attracted to an enterprise of mediocre promise because of the pseudo-security provided by the bond contract. Our opposition to any compromise between the purely investment and the admittedly speculative attitude is based primarily on subjective grounds. Where an intermediate stand is taken, the result is usually confusion, clouded thinking, and self-deception. The investor who relaxes his safety requirements to obtain a profit-sharing privilege is frequently not prepared, financially or mentally, for the inevitable loss if fortune should frown on the venture. The speculator who wants to reduce his risk by operating in convertible issues is likely to find his primary interest divided between the enterprise itself and the terms of the privilege, and he will probably be uncertain in his own mind as to whether he is at bottom a stockholder or a bondholder. Privileged issues selling at substantial discounts from par are not in general subject to this principle, since they belong to the second category of speculative senior securities to be considered later. Reverting to our examples, it will be seen at once that the Commonwealth Edison 3.5s could properly have been purchased as an investment without any regard to the conversion feature. The strong possibility that this privilege would be of value made the bond almost uniquely attractive at the time of issuance. Somewhat similar statements could be made with respect to the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Rand Cardex bonds. Any of these three securities should also have been attractive to a speculator who was persuaded that the related common stock was due for an advance in price. On the other hand, the National Trade Journal's debentures could not have passed stringent qualitative and quantitative tests of safety. Hence, they should properly have been of interest only to a person who had full confidence in the future value of the stock. It is hardly likely, however, that most of the buying of this issue was motivated by the primary desire to invest or speculate in the National Trade Journal's common stock, but it was based rather on the attractive terms of the conversion privilege and on the feeling that the issue was fairly safe as a bond investment. It is precisely this compromise between true investment and true speculation that we disapprove, chiefly because the purchaser has no clear-cut idea of the purpose of his commitment or of the risk that he is incurring. Rules regarding retention or sale. Having stated a basic principle to guide the selection of privileged issues, we ask next what rules can be established regarding their subsequent retention or sale. Convertibles bought primarily as a form of commitment in the common stock may be held for a larger profit than those acquired from the investment standpoint. If a bond of the former class advances from 100 to 150, the large premium need not in itself be a controlling reason for selling out. The owner must be guided rather by his views as to whether or not the common stock has advanced enough to justify taking his profit. But when the purchase is made primarily as a safe bond investment, then the limitation on the amount of profit that can conservatively be waited for comes directly into play. For the reasons explained in detail above, the conservative buyer of privileged issues will not ordinarily hold them for more than a 25 to 35% advance. This means that a really successful investment operation in the convertible field does not cover a long period of time. Hence, such issues should be bought with the possibility of long-term holding in mind, but with the hope that the potential profit will be realized fairly soon. The foregoing discussion leads to the statement of another investment rule, viz., in the typical case, a convertible bond should not be converted by the investor. It should be either held or sold. It is true that the object of the privilege is to bring about such conversion when it seems advantageous. If the price of the bond advances substantially, its current yield will shrink to an unattractive figure, and there is ordinarily a substantial gain in income to be realized through the exchange into stock. Nevertheless, when the investor does exchange his bond into the stock, he abandons the priority and the unqualified claim to principal and interest upon which the purchase was originally premised. If after the conversion is made things should go badly, his shares may decline in value far below the original cost of his bond, and he will lose not only his profit but part of his principal as well. Moreover, he is running the risk of transforming himself, generally as well as in the specific instances, from a bond investor into a stock speculator. It must be recognized that there is something insidious about even a good convertible bond. It can easily prove a costly snare to the unwary. To avoid this danger, the investor must cling determinedly to a conservative viewpoint. When the price of his bond has passed out of the investment range, he must sell it. Most important of all, he must not consider his judgment impugned if the bond subsequently rises to a much higher level. The market behavior of the issue, once it has entered the speculative range, is no more the investor's affair than the price gyrations of any speculative stock about which he knows nothing. If the course of action here recommended is followed by investors generally, the conversion of bonds would be brought about only through their purchase for this specific purpose by persons who have decided independently to acquire the shares for either speculation or supposed investment. The arguments against the investor's converting convertible issues apply with equal force against his exercising stock purchase warrants attached to bonds bought for investment purposes. A continued policy of investment in privileged issues would, under favorable conditions, require rather frequent taking of profits and replacement by new securities not selling at an excessive premium. More concretely, a bond bought at 100 would be sold, say at 125, and be replaced by another good convertible issue purchasable at about par. It is not likely that satisfactory opportunities of this kind will be continuously available, or that the investor would have the means of locating all those that are at hand. But the trend of financing in recent years offers some promise that a fair number of really attractive convertibles may again make their appearance. Following the 1926 to 1929 period, marked by a flood of privileged issues generally of poor quality, and of the 1930 to 1934 period, in which the emphasis on safety caused the virtual disappearance of conversion privileges from new bond offerings, there has been a definite swing of the pendulum towards a middle point, where participating features are at times employed to facilitate the sale of sound bond offerings. Most of those sold between 1934 and 1939 either carried very low coupon rates or immediately jumped to a prohibitive premium. But we incline to the view that the discriminating and careful investor is again likely to find a reasonable number of attractive opportunities presented in this field. Chapter 23. Technical Characteristics of Privileged Senior Securities. In the preceding chapter, privileged senior issues were considered in their relationship to the broader principles of investment and speculation. To arrive at an adequate knowledge of this group of securities from their practical side, a more intensive discussion of their characteristics is now in order. Such a study may conveniently be carried on from three successive viewpoints. 1. Considerations common to all three types of privilege: conversion, participation, and subscription, that is, warrant. 2. The relative merits of each type as compared with the others. 3. Technical aspects of each type considered by itself. Considerations generally applicable to privileged issues. The attractiveness of a profit-sharing feature depends upon two major but entirely unrelated factors. 1. The terms of the arrangement, and 2. The prospects of profits to share. To use a simple illustration, Company A, 4% bond selling at 100, convertible into stock at 50, that is, 2 shares of stock for a $100 bond. Stock selling at 30. Company B, 4% bond selling at 100, convertible into stock at 33 1/3. That is, 3 shares of stock for a $100 bond. stock selling at 30. Terms of the privilege versus prospects for the enterprise. The terms of the conversion privilege are evidently more attractive in the case of Bond B, for the stock need advance only a little more than 3 points to assure a profit, whereas stock A must advance over 20 points to make conversion profitable. Nevertheless, it is quite possible that Bond A may turn out to be the more advantageous purchase, for conceivably stock B may fail to advance at all, while stock A may double or triple in price. As between the two factors, it is undoubtedly true that it is more profitable to select the right company than to select the issue with the most desirable terms. There is certainly no mathematical basis on which the attractiveness of the enterprise may be offset against the terms of the privilege, and a balance struck between these two entirely dissociated elements of value. But in analyzing privileged issues of the investment grade, the terms of the privilege must receive the greater attention, not because they are more important, but because they can be more definitely dealt with. It may seem a comparatively easy matter to determine that one enterprise is more promising than another, but it is by no means so easy to establish that one common stock at a given price is clearly preferable to another stock at its current price. Reverting to our example, if it were quite certain, or even reasonably probable, that stock A is more likely to advance to 50 than stock B to advance to 33, then both issues would not be quoted at 30. Stock A, of course, would be selling higher. The point we make is that the market price in general reflects already any superiority that one enterprise has demonstrated over another. The investor who prefers Bond A because he expects its related stock to rise a great deal faster than stock B is exercising independent judgment in a field where certainty is lacking and where mistakes are necessarily frequent. For this reason, we doubt that a successful policy of buying privileged issues from the investment approach can be based primarily upon the purchaser's view regarding the future expansion of the profits of the enterprise. In stating this point, we are merely repeating a principle previously laid down in the field of fixed value investment. Where the speculative approach is followed, that is, where the issue is bought primarily as a desirable method of acquiring an interest in the stock, it would be quite logical, of course, to assign dominant weight to the buyer's judgment as to the future of the company. 3 important elements. 1. Extent of the privilege. In examining the terms of a profit-sharing privilege, 3 component elements are seen to enter. These are: A. The extent of the profit-sharing or speculative interest per dollar of investment. B. The closeness of the privilege to a realizable profit at the time of purchase. C. The duration of the privilege. The amount of speculative interest attaching to a convertible or warrant-bearing senior security is equal to the current market value of the number of shares of stock covered by the privilege. Other things being equal, the larger the amount of the speculative interest per dollar of investment, the more attractive the privilege. Examples: Rand Cardex 5 1/2s previously described carried warrants to buy 22 1/2 shares of Class A stock initially at 40. Current price of Class A stock was 42. The speculative interest amounted to 22 1/2 times 42, or $945 per $1,000 bond. Reliable Stores Corporation 6s, offered in 1927, carried warrants to buy only 5 shares of common stock initially at 10. Current price of the common was 12. Hence, the speculative interest amounted to 5 times 12, or only $60 per $1,000 bond. Intercontinental Rubber Products Company 7s offered an extraordinary example of a large speculative interest attaching to a bond. As a result of peculiar provisions surrounding their issuance in 1922, each $1,000 note was convertible into 100 shares of stock and also carried the right to purchase 400 additional shares at 10. When the stock sold at 10 in 1925, the speculative interest per $1,000 note amounted to 500 times 10, or $5,000. If the notes were then selling, say, at 120, the speculative interest would have equaled 417% of the bond investment, or 70 times as great as in the case of the reliable store's offering. The practical importance of the amount of speculative interest can be illustrated by the following comparison covering the three examples above given. This comparison may be found in the accompanying PDF. In the case of convertible bonds, the speculative interest always amounts to 100% of the bond at par when the stock sells at the conversion price. Hence, in these issues, our first and second component elements express the same fact. If a bond selling at par is convertible into stock at 50, and if the stock sells at 30, then the speculative interest amounts to 60% of the commitment, which is the same thing as saying that the current price of the stock is 60% of that needed before conversion would be profitable. Stock purchase warrant issues disclose no such fixed relationship between the amount of the speculative interest and the proximity of this interest to a realizable profit. In the case of the reliable store sixes, the speculative interest was very small, but it showed an actual profit at the time of issuance since the stock was selling above the subscription price. Significance of call on large number of shares at low price. It may be said parenthetically that a speculative interest in a large number of shares selling at a low price is technically more attractive than one in a smaller number of shares selling at a high price. This is because low-priced shares are apt to fluctuate over a wider range percentage-wise than higher-priced stocks. Hence, if a bond is both well secured and convertible into many shares at a low price, it will have an excellent chance for very large profit without being subject to the offsetting risk of greater loss through a speculative dip in the price of the stock. For example, as a matter of form of privilege, the Ohio Copper Company 7s due 1931, convertible into 1,000 shares of stock selling at $1, had better possibilities than the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe convertible 4.5s due 1948, convertible into 6 shares of common selling at $166 2/3, although in each case the amount of speculative interest equaled $1,000 per bond. As it turned out, Ohio Copper stock advanced from less than $1 a share in 1928 to 4 7/8 in 1929, making the bond worth close to 500% of par. It would have required a rise in the price of Atchison from $166 to $800 to yield the same profit on the convertible 4.5s, but the highest price reached in 1929 was under $300. In the case of participating issues, the extent of the profit-sharing interest would ordinarily be considered in terms of the amount of extra income that may conceivably be obtained as a result of the privilege. A limited extra payment, for example, Bayuk Cigars, Inc., 7% preferred, which may receive not more than 1% additional, is of course less attractive than an unlimited participation. For example, White Rock Mineral Springs Company, 5% second preferred, which received a total of 26.25% in 1930. 2 and 3. Closeness and duration of the privilege. The implications of the second and third factors in valuing a privilege are readily apparent. A privilege having a long period to run is in that respect more desirable than one expiring in a short time. The nearer the current price of the stock to the level at which conversion or subscription becomes profitable, the more attractive does the privilege become. In the case of a participation feature, it is similarly desirable that the current dividends or earnings on the common stock should be close to the figure at which the extra distribution on the senior issue commences. By conversion price is meant the price of the common stock equivalent to a price of $100 for the convertible issue. If a preferred stock is convertible into 1 2/3 as many shares of common, the conversion price of the common is therefore $60. The term conversion parity or conversion level may be used to designate that price of the common, which is equivalent to a given quotation for the convertible issue, or vice versa. It can be found by multiplying the price of the convertible issue by the conversion price of the common. If the preferred stock just mentioned is selling at 90, the conversion parity of the common becomes 60 times 90% equals 54. This means that to a buyer of the preferred at 90, an advance in the common above 54 will create a realizable profit. Conversely, if the common sold at 66, one might say that the conversion parity of the preferred is 110. The closeness of the privilege may be stated arithmetically as the ratio between the market price and the conversion parity of the common stock. In the foregoing example, if the common is selling at 54 and the preferred at 110, equivalent to 66 for the common, the index of closeness becomes 54 divided by 66, or 0.82. Comparative merits of the three types of privileges. From the theoretical standpoint, a participating feature, unlimited in time and possible amount, is the most desirable type of profit-sharing privilege. This arrangement enables the investor to derive the specific benefit of participation in profits, viz., increased income, without modifying his original position as a senior security holder. These benefits may be received over a long period of years. By contrast, a conversion privilege can result in higher income only through actual exchange into the stock and consequent surrender of the senior position. Its real advantage consists, therefore, only of the opportunity to make a profit through the sale of the convertible issue at the right time. Similarly, the benefits from a subscription privilege may conservatively be realized only through sale of the warrants, or by the subscription to and prompt sale of the stock. If the common stock is purchased and held for permanent income, the operation involves the risking of additional money on a basis entirely different from the original purchase of the senior issue. Example of advantage of unlimited participation privilege. An excellent practical example of the theoretical advantages attaching to a well-entrenched participating security is afforded by Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company Preferred. This issue is entitled to cumulative prior dividends of $3.50 per annum, 7% on $50 par, and in addition participates equally per share with the common in any dividends paid on the latter in excess of $3.50. As far back as 1917, Westinghouse Preferred could have been bought at 52.5, representing an attractive straight investment with additional possibilities through its participating feature. In the ensuing 15 years to 1932, a total of about $7 per share was disbursed in extra dividends above the basic 7%. In the meantime, an opportunity arose to sell out at a large profit, the high price being $2.84 in 1929, which corresponded to the enhancement possibilities of a convertible or subscription warrant issue. If the stock was not sold, the profit was naturally lost in the ensuing market decline. But the investor's original position remained unimpaired, for at the low point of 1932 the issue was still paying the 7% dividend and selling at 52.5, although the common had passed its dividend and had fallen to 15 5/8. In this instance, the investor was able to participate in the surplus profits of the common stock in good years while maintaining his preferred position so that, when the bad years came, he lost only his temporary profit. Had the issue been convertible instead of participating, the investor could have received the higher dividends only through converting and would later have found the dividend omitted on his common shares and their value fallen far below his original investment. Participating issues at disadvantage market-wise. Although from the standpoint of long pool investment holding, participating issues are theoretically the most desirable. They may behave somewhat less satisfactorily in a major market upswing than do convertible or subscription warrant issues. During such a period, a participating senior security may regularly sell below its proper comparative price. In the case of Westinghouse Preferred, for example, its price during 1929 was usually from 5 to 10 points lower than that of the common, although its intrinsic value per share could not be less than that of the junior stock. The reason for this phenomenon is as follows. The price of the common stock is made largely by speculators interested chiefly in quick profits, to secure which they need an active market. The preferred stock, being closely held, is relatively inactive. Consequently, the speculators are willing to pay several points more for the inferior common issue simply because it can be bought and sold more readily, and because other speculators are likely to be willing to pay more for it also. The same anomaly arises in the case of closely held common stocks with voting power compared with the more active non-voting issue of the same company. American Tobacco B and Liggett and Myers Tobacco B, both non-voting, have for years sold higher than the voting stock. A similar situation formerly existed in the two common issues of Bethlehem Steel, Pan American Petroleum, and others. The paradoxical principle holds true for the securities market generally that, in the absence of a special demand, relative scarcity is likely to make for a lower rather than a higher price. In cases such as Westinghouse and American Tobacco, the proper corporate policy would be to extend to the holder of the intrinsically more valuable issue the privilege of exchanging it for the more active but intrinsically inferior issue. The White Rock Company actually took this step. Although the holders of the participating preferred might make a mistake in accepting such an offer, they cannot object to its being made to them, and the common stockholders may gain but cannot lose through its acceptance. Relative price behavior of convertible and warrant-bearing issues. From the standpoint of price behavior under favorable market conditions, the best results are obtained by holders of senior securities with detachable stock purchase warrants. To illustrate this point, we shall compare a certain price relationship shown in 1929 between four privileged issues and the corresponding common stocks. The issues are as follows. 1. Mohawk Hudson Power Corporation 7% second preferred, carrying warrants to buy 2 shares of common at $50 for each share of preferred. 2. White Sewing Machine Corporation 6% debentures due 1936, carrying warrants to buy 2.5 shares of common stock for each $100 bond. 3. Central States Electric Corporation 6% preferred, convertible into common stock at $118 per share. 4. Independent Oil and Gas Company debentures 6s, due 1939, convertible into common stock at $32 per share. The following table, which may be found in the accompanying PDF, shows in striking fashion that in speculative markets, issues with purchase warrants have a tendency to sell at large premiums in relation to the common stock price, and that these premiums are much greater than in the case of similarly situated convertible issues. Advantage of separability of speculative component. This advantage of subscription warrant issues is due largely to the fact that their speculative component, that is, the subscription warrant itself, can be entirely separated from their investment component, that is, the bond or preferred stock X warrants. Speculators are always looking for a chance to make large profits on a small cash commitment. This is a distinguishing characteristic of stock option warrants, as will be shown in detail in our later discussion of these instruments. In an advancing market, therefore, speculators bid for the warrants attached to these privileged issues, and hence they sell separately at a substantial price even though they may have no immediate exercisable value. These speculators greatly prefer buying the option warrants to buying a corresponding convertible bond because the latter requires a much larger cash investment per share of common stock involved. It follows, therefore, that the separate market values of the bond plus the option warrant, which combine to make the price of the bond with warrants, may considerably exceed the single quotation for a closely similar convertible issue. Second advantage of warrant-bearing issues. Subscription warrant issues have a second point of superiority in respect to callable provisions. A right reserved by the corporation to redeem an issue prior to maturity must in general be considered as a disadvantage to the holder, for presumably it will be exercised only when it is to the benefit of the issuer to do so, which means usually that the security would otherwise sell for more than the call price. A callable provision, unless at a very high premium, might entirely vitiate the value of a participating privilege. For with such a provision, there would be danger of redemption as soon as the company grew prosperous enough to place the issue in line for extra distributions. In some cases, participating issues that are callable are made convertible as well, in order to give them a chance to benefit from any large advance in the market price of the common that may have taken place up to the time of call. See, for examples, National Distillers Products Corporation $2.50 cumulative participating convertible preferred, Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company $1.50 participating convertible Class A stock. Participating bonds are generally limited in their right to participate in surplus earnings and are commonly callable. See White Sewing Machine Corporation participating debenture 6s due 1940, United Steelworks Corporation participating 6 1/2s Series A due 1947, neither of which is convertible. Sometimes participating issues are protected against loss of the privilege through redemption by setting the call price at a very high figure. Something of this sort was apparently attempted in the case of San Francisco Toll Bridge Company participating 7s due 1942, which were callable at $1.20 through November 1st, 1933, and at lower prices thereafter. Celluloid Corporation participating 2nd preferred is callable at $1.50, whereas Celanese Corporation participating 1st preferred is non-callable. Another device to prevent vitiating the participating privilege through redemption is to make the issue callable at a price that may be directly dependent upon the value of the participating privilege. For example, Siemens and Hauschke participating debentures due in 2930 are callable after April 1st, 1942, at the average market price for the issue during the 6 months preceding notice of redemption, but at not less than the original issue price, which was over 230% of the par value. The Kruger and Toll 5% participating debentures had similar provisions. Even in the case of a convertible issue, a callable feature is technically a serious drawback because it may operate to reduce the duration of the privilege. Conceivably, a convertible bond may be called just when the privilege is about to acquire real value. But in the case of issues with stock purchase warrants, the subscription privilege almost invariably runs its full time even though the senior issue itself may be called prior to maturity. If the warrant is detachable, it simply continues its separate existence until its own expiration date. Frequently, the subscription privilege is made non-detachable. That is, it can be exercised only by presentation of the senior security. But even in these instances, if the issue should be redeemed prior to the expiration of the purchase option period, it is customary to give the holder a separate warrant running for the balance of the time originally provided. Example: prior to January 1st, 1934, United Aircraft and Transport Corporation had outstanding 150,000 shares of 6% cumulative preferred stock. These shares carried non-detachable warrants for 1 share of common stock at $30 a share for each 2 shares of preferred stock held. The subscription privilege was to run to November 1st, 1938, and was protected by a provision for the issuance of a detached warrant evidencing the same privilege per share in case the preferred stock was redeemed prior to November 1st, 1938. Some of the preferred stock was called for redemption on January 1st, 1933, and detached warrants were accordingly issued to the holders thereof. A year later, the remainder of the issue was called and additional warrants issued. Third advantage of warrant-bearing issues. Subscription warrant issues have still a third advantage over other privileged securities, and this is in a practical sense probably the most important of all. Let us consider what courses of conduct are open to holders of each type in the favorable event that the company prospers, that a high dividend is paid on the common, and that the common sells at a high price. 1. Holder of a participating issue. A. May sell at a profit. B. May hold and receive participating income. 2. Holder of a convertible issue. A. May sell at a profit. B. May hold but will receive no benefit from high common dividend. C. May convert to secure larger income but sacrifices his senior position. 3. Holder of an issue with stock purchase warrants. A. May sell at a profit. B. May hold but will receive no benefit from high common dividend. C. May subscribe to common to receive high dividend. He may invest new capital, or he may sell or apply his security X warrants to provide funds to pay for the common. In either case, he undertakes the risks of a common stockholder in order to receive the high dividend income. D. May dispose of his warrants at a cash profit and retain his original security X warrants. The warrant may be sold directly, or he may subscribe to the stock and immediately sell it at the current indicated profit. The fourth option listed above is peculiar to a subscription warrant issue and has no counterpart in convertible or participating securities. It permits the holder to cash his profit from the speculative component of the issue and still maintain his original investment position. Since the typical buyer of a privileged senior issue should be interested primarily in making a sound investment, with a secondary opportunity to profit from the privilege, this fourth optional course of conduct may prove a great convenience. He is not under the necessity of selling the entire commitment as he would be if he owned a convertible, which would then require him to find some new medium for the funds involved. The reluctance to sell one good thing and buy another, which characterizes the typical investor, is one of the reasons that holders of high-priced convertibles are prone to convert them rather than to dispose of them. In the case of participating issues also, the owner can protect his principal profit only by selling out and thus creating a reinvestment problem. Example: the theoretical and practical advantage of subscription warrant issues in this respect may be illustrated in the case of Commercial Investment Trust Corporation's 6.5% preferred. This was issued in 1925 and carried warrants to buy common stock at an initial price of $80 per share. In 1929, the warrants sold as high as $69.50 per share of preferred. The holder of this issue was therefore enabled to sell out its speculative component at a high price and to retain his original preferred stock commitment, which maintained an investment status throughout the Depression until it was finally called for redemption at 110 on April 1, 1933. At the time of the redemption call, the common stock was selling at the equivalent of about $50 per old share. If the preferred stock had been convertible instead of carrying warrants, many of the holders would undoubtedly have been led to convert and to retain the common shares. Instead of netting a large profit, they would have been faced with a substantial loss. Summary. To summarize this section, it may be said that, for long pool holding, a sound participating issue represents the best form of profit-sharing privilege. From the standpoint of maximum price advance under favorable market conditions, a senior issue with detachable stock purchase warrants is likely to show the best results. Furthermore, subscription warrant issues as a class have definite advantages in that the privilege is ordinarily not subject to curtailment through early redemption of the security, and they permit the realization of a speculative profit while retaining the original investment position. Chapter 24. Technical Aspects of Convertible Issues. The third division of the subject of privileged issues relates to technical aspects of each type, separately considered. We shall first discuss convertible issues. The effective terms of a conversion privilege are frequently subject to change during the life of the issue. These changes are of two kinds. 1. a decrease in the conversion price to protect the holder against dilution, and 2, an increase in the conversion price, in accordance usually with a sliding scale arrangement for the benefit of the company. Dilution and anti-dilution clauses. The value of a common stock is said to be diluted if there is an increase in the number of shares without a corresponding increase in assets and earning power. Dilution may arise through split-ups, stock dividends, offers of subscription rights at a low price, and issuance of stock for property or services at a low valuation per share. The standard anti-dilution provisions of a convertible issue endeavor to reduce the conversion price proportionately to any decrease in the per-share value arising through any act of dilution. The method may be expressed in a formula as follows. Let C be the conversion price, O be the number of shares now outstanding, N be the number of new shares to be issued, and P be the price at which they are to be issued. Then, C, the new conversion price, equals CO plus NP divided by O plus N. An example of an anti-dilution adjustment is afforded by the Central States Electric Corporation's 6% convertible preferred previously referred to. After its issuance in 1928, the common stock received successive stock dividends of 100 and 200%. The conversion price was accordingly first cut in half from $118 to $59 per share, and then again reduced by 2/3 to $19.66 per share. A much less frequent provision merely reduces the conversion price to any lower figure at which new shares may be issued. This is, of course, more favorable to the holder of the convertible issue. Protection against dilution not complete. Although practically all convertibles now have anti-dilution provisions, there have been exceptions. As a matter of course, a prospective buyer should make certain that such protection exists for the issue he is considering. It should be borne in mind that the effect of these provisions is to preserve only the principal or par value of the privileged issue against dilution. If a convertible is selling considerably above par, the premium will still be subject to impairment through additional stock issues or special dividend. A simple illustration will make this clear. A bond is convertible into stock, par for par. The usual anti-dilution clauses are present. Both bond and stock are selling at 200. Stockholders are given the right to buy new stock, share for share, at par, $100. These rights will be worth $50 per share, and the new stock, or the old stock X rights, will be worth $150. No change will be made in the conversion basis because the new stock is not issued below the old conversion price. However, the effect of offering these rights must be to compel immediate conversion of the bonds, since otherwise they would lose 25% of their value. As the stock will be worth only 150 X rights instead of 200, the value of the unconverted bonds would drop proportionately. The foregoing discussion indicates that when a large premium or market profit is created for a privileged issue, the situation is vulnerable to sudden change. Although prompt action will always prevent loss through such changes, their effect is always to terminate the effective life of the privilege. The same result will follow, of course, from the calling of a privileged issue for redemption at a price below its then conversion value. Where the number of shares is reduced through recapitalization, it is customary to increase the conversion price proportionately. Such recapitalization measures include increases in par value, reverse split-ups, for example, issuance of one no-par share in place of, say, 5 old shares, and exchanges of the old stock for fewer new shares through consolidation with another company. Sliding scales designed to accelerate conversion. The provisions just discussed are intended to maintain equitably the original basis of conversion in the event of subsequent capitalization changes. On the other hand, a sliding scale arrangement is intended definitely to reduce the value of the privilege as time goes on. The underlying purpose is to accelerate conversion, in other words, to curtail the effective duration and hence the real value of the option. Obviously, any diminution of the worth of the privilege to its recipients must correspondingly benefit the donors of the privilege, who are the company's common shareholders. The more usual terms of a sliding scale prescribe a series of increases in the conversion price in successive periods of time. A more recent variation makes the conversion price increase as soon as a certain portion of the issue has been exchanged. Examples: American Telephone and Telegraph Company 10-year debenture 4.5s, due 1939, issued in 1929, were made convertible into common at $180 per share during 1930, at $190 per share during 1931 and 1932, and at $200 per share during 1933 to 1937 inclusive. These prices were later reduced through the issuance of additional stock at $100 in accordance with the standard anti-dilution provision. Anaconda Copper Mining Company debenture 7s, due 1938, were issued in the amount of $50 million. The first $10 million presented were convertible into common stock at $53 per share. The second $10 million were convertible at $56, the third at $59, the fourth at $62, and the final lot at $65. An $8 million issue of Hiram Walker Goderham and Wirtz 4.25s, due 1945, was convertible as follows: at $40 per share for the first $2 million block of bonds, at $45 per share for the next block of $2 million, the third block at $55, and the final block at $60 per share. Sliding scale based on time intervals. The former type of sliding scale based on time intervals is a readily understandable method of reducing the liberality of a conversion privilege. Its effect can be shown in the case of Puerto Rican American Tobacco Company 6s, due 1942. These were convertible into pledged Congress Cigar Company Inc. stock at $80 per share prior to January 2, 1929, at $85 during the next 3 years, and at $90 thereafter. During 1928, the highest price reached by Congress Cigar was $87 1/4, which was only a moderate premium above the conversion price. Nevertheless, a number of holders were induced to convert before the year end because of the impending rise in the conversion basis. These conversions proved very ill-advised, since the price of the common fell to $43 in 1929 against a low of $89 for the bonds. In this instance, the adverse change in the conversion basis not only meant a smaller potential profit for those who delayed conversion until after 1928, but also involved a risk of serious loss through inducing conversion at the wrong time. Sliding scale based on extent privilege is exercised. The second method, however, based on the quantities converted, is not so simple in its implications, since it gives the first lot of bonds converted an advantage over the next. It evidently provides a competitive stimulus to early conversion. By so doing, it creates a conflict in the minds of the holder between the desire to retain his senior position and the fear of losing the more favorable basis of conversion through prior action by other bondholders. This fear of being forestalled will ordinarily result in large-scale conversions as soon as the stock advances moderately above the initial conversion price, that is, as soon as the bond is worth slightly more than the original cost. Accordingly, the price of the senior issue should oscillate over a relatively narrow range while the common stock is advancing and while successive blocks of bonds are being converted. Example: the sequence of events normally to be expected is shown fairly well by the market action of Hiram Walker Goderham and Wirtz convertible 4.25s described previously. The bonds issued in 1936 at par ranged in price between $100 and $111 1/4 during 1936 to 1939. In the same period, the stock ranged between 26 1/8 and 54. If the initial conversion price of $40 for the stock had prevailed throughout the period, the bonds should have sold for at least $135 when the stock sold at $54. But meanwhile, as the price of the stock rose, successive blocks of the bonds were converted, partly under the impetus supplied by successive calls for redemption of parts of the issue. thus tipping off higher conversion prices until the $55 bracket was reached in 1937. In consequence, the bonds did not appreciate commensurately with the rise in the price of the stock. When the last block under such a sliding scale is reached, the competitive element disappears, and the bond or preferred stock is then in the position of an ordinary convertible, free to advance indefinitely with the stock. It should be pointed out that issues with such a sliding scale provision do not always follow this theoretical behavior pattern. The Anaconda Copper Company Convertible 7s, for example, actually sold at a high premium, 30%, in 1928 before the first block was exhausted. This seems to have been one of the anomalous incidents of the highly speculative atmosphere at the time. From the standpoint of critical analysis, a convertible of this type must be considered as having very limited possibilities of enhancement until the common stock approaches the last and highest conversion price. The sliding scale privilege on a block basis belongs to the objectionable category of devices that tend to mislead the holder of securities as to the real nature and value of what he owns. The competitive pressure to take advantage of a limited opportunity introduces an element of compulsion into the exercise of the conversion right, which is directly opposed to that freedom of choice for a reasonable time, which is the essential merit of such a privilege. There seems no reason why investment bankers should inject so confusing and contradictory a feature into a security issue. Sound practice would dictate its complete abandonment, or in any event the avoidance of such issues by intelligent investors. Issues convertible into preferred stock. Many bond issues were formerly made convertible into preferred stock. Ordinarily, some increase in income was offered to make the provision appear attractive. For examples, see Missouri, Kansas, Texas Railroad Company Adjustment 5s due 1967, convertible prior to January 1, 1932 into $7 preferred stock. Central States Electric Corporation Debenture 5s due 1948, convertible into $6 preferred stock. G.R. Kinney Company secured 7.5s due 1936, convertible into $8 preferred stock. American Electric Power Corporation 6s due 1957, convertible into $7 preferred stock. There have been instances in which a fair-sized profit has been realized through such a conversion right, but the upper limitation on the market value of the ordinary preferred stock is likely to keep down the maximum benefits from such a privilege to a modest figure. Moreover, since developments in recent years have made preferred stocks in general appear far less desirable than formerly, the right to convert, say, from a 4% bond into a 5% preferred is likely to constitute more of a danger to the unwary than an inducement to the alert investor. If the latter is looking for convertibles, he should canvass the market thoroughly and endeavor to find a suitably secured issue convertible into common stock. In a few cases where the bonds are convertible into preferred stock, the latter is in turn convertible into common or participates therewith, and this double arrangement may be equivalent to convertibility of the bond into common stock. For example, International Hydroelectric System 6s due 1944 are convertible into Class A stock, which is in reality a participating second preferred. There are also bond issues convertible into either preferred or common, or into a combination of certain amounts of each. Although any individual issue of this sort may turn out well, in general it may be said that complicated provisions of this sort should be avoided, both by issuing companies and by security buyers, because they tend to create confusion. Bonds convertible at the option of the company. The unending flood of variations in the terms of conversion and other privileges that developed during the 1920s made it difficult for the untrained investor to distinguish between the attractive, the merely harmless, and the positively harmful. Hence, he proved an easy victim to unsound financing practices which in former times might have stood out as questionable because of their departure from the standard. As an example of this sort, we cite the various Associated Gas and Electric Company convertible obligations, which were made convertible by their terms into preferred or Class A stock at the option of the company. Such a contraption was nothing more than a preferred stock masquerading as a bond. If the purchasers were entirely aware of this fact and were willing to invest in the preferred stock, they would presumably have no cause to complain. But it goes without saying that an artifice of this kind lends itself far too readily to concealment and possible misrepresentation. Bonds convertible into other bonds. Some bonds are convertible into other bonds. The usual case is that of a short-term issue, the holder of which is given the right to exchange into a long-term bond of the same company. Frequently, the long-term bond is deposited as collateral security for the note. For example, Interborough Rapid Transit Company 7s, due 1932, were secured by deposit of $1,736 of the same company's first and refunding 5s, due 1966, for each $1,000 note, and they were also convertible into the deposited collateral, the final rate being $1,000 of 5s for $900 of 7% notes. The holder thus has an option either to demand repayment at an early date or to make a long-term commitment in the enterprise. In practice, this amounts merely to the chance of a moderate profit at or before maturity in the event that the company prospers or interest rates fall, or both. Unlike the case of a bond convertible into a preferred stock, there is usually a reduction in the coupon rate when a short-term note is converted into a long-term bond. The reason is that short-term notes are ordinarily issued when interest rates, either in general or for the specific company, are regarded as abnormally high, so that the company is unwilling to incur so steep a rate for a long-term bond. It is thus expected that, when normal conditions return, long-term bonds can be floated at a much lower rate, and hence the right to exchange the note for a long-term bond, even on a basis involving some reduction in income, may prove to be valuable. Convertible bonds with an original market value in excess of par. One of the extraordinary developments of the 1928 to 1929 financial pyrotechnics was the offering of convertible issues with an original market value greatly in excess of par. This is illustrated by Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Company convertible 4.5s due 1948, and by American Telephone and Telegraph Company convertible 4.5s due 1939. Initial trading in the former on the New York curb market on a when-issued basis in November 1928 was around 125, and initial trading in the latter on the New York Stock Exchange on a when-issued basis on May 1, 1929, was at 142. Obviously, investment in the bonds at these levels represented primarily a commitment in the common stock, since they were immediately subject to the danger of a substantial loss of principal value if the stock declined. Furthermore, the income return was entirely too low to come under our definition of investment. Although it may be thought that the stockholders were acquiring a normal investment through the exercise of their subscription right to purchase the issues at par, the essential nature of their commitment was determined by the initial market value of the security to which they were subscribing. For this reason, we think such financing should be condemned, because under the guise of an attractive investment, it created a basically speculative form of security. A technical feature of some convertible issues. A technical feature of the American Telephone and Telegraph convertible issue deserves mention. The bonds were made convertible at $180, but instead of presenting $180 of bonds to obtain a share of stock, the holder might present $100 of bonds and $80 in cash. The effect of such an option is to make the bond more valuable whenever the stock sells above $180. That is, whenever the conversion value of the bond exceeds $100. This is illustrated as follows. If the stock sells at $360, a straight conversion basis of $180 would make the bond worth $200. But by the provision accepting $80 per share in cash, the value of the bond becomes $360 minus 80 equals $280. This arrangement may be characterized as a combination of a conversion privilege at $180 with the stock purchase right at $100. Delayed conversion privilege. The privilege of converting is sometimes not operative immediately upon issuance of the obligation. Examples. This was true, for example, of Brooklyn Union Gas Company convertible 5.5s. Although they were issued in December 1925, the right to convert did not accrue until January 1, 1929. Similarly, New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad Company convertible debenture 6s, due in 1948, although issued in 1907, were not convertible until January 15, 1923. Chesapeake Corporation convertible 5s, due 1947, were issued in 1927, but did not become convertible until May 15, 1932. More commonly, the suspension of the conversion privilege does not last so long as these examples indicate, but in any event this practice introduces an additional factor of uncertainty and tends to render the privilege less valuable than it would be otherwise. This feature may account in part for the spread which existed during 1926, 1927, and the early part of 1928 between the Brooklyn Union Gas Company 5.5s and the related common stock. Chapter 25. Senior Securities with Warrants, Participating Issues, Switching, and Hedging. Nearly all the variations found in convertible issues have their counterpart in the terms of subscription warrants. The purchase price of the stock is ordinarily subject to change up or down corresponding to the standard provisions for adjusting a conversion price. Example: White Eagle Oil and Refining Company debenture 5.5s, due 1937, were offered in March 1927 and carried warrants entitling the holder to subscribe on or before March 15, 1932, to 10 shares of the capital stock of the company at the following prices: $32 per share to and including March 15, 1928, and thereafter at $34 per share to and including March 15, 1929, and thereafter at $86 per share to and including March 15, 1930, and thereafter at $38 per share to and including March 15, 1931, and thereafter at $40 per share to and including March 15, 1932. On January 27, 1930, the Standard Oil Company of New York acquired the White Eagle properties by assuming the liabilities of the latter company and exchanging 8.5 shares of Standard Oil of New York for each 10 shares of White Eagle. In accordance with the terms of the indenture protecting the warrants against dilution and providing for readjustment of the subscription price in the case of a sale of the properties or merger of the company, the warrants thereafter entitled the holder to subscribe to 8.5 shares of Standard Oil of New York, now Saucony Vacuum Corporation, at $42.35 per share to and including March 15, 1930, at $44.71 for the next year and at $47.06 for the following year. Sliding scales of both types. Sliding scale arrangements of both types are also encountered in option warrant issues. Examples: Interstate Department Stores, Inc. 7% preferred, issued in 1928, carried non-detachable warrants entitling the holder to purchase common stock, share for share, at the following prices: $87 per share up to January 31, 1929, $42 per share up to January 31, 1931, $47 per share up to January 31, 1938. Central States Electric Corporation optional 5.5% debentures due 1954 carried detachable warrants entitling the holder to buy on or before September 15, 1934, 10 shares of common stock for each $1,000 bond at the following prices: $89 per share for the first 25% of the warrants exercised, $94 per share for the next 26% of the warrants exercised, $99 per share for the next 25% of the warrants exercised, $104 per share for the last 26% of the warrants exercised. As with convertibles, a sliding scale based on the block principle detracts greatly from the value of the privilege until the last block, that is, the highest price, is reached, at which time it becomes an ordinary purchase option. Methods of payment. Stock purchase warrants attached to bonds or preferred stocks frequently provide that payment for the common stock may be made either in cash or by turning in the senior security itself at par. Such an arrangement may prove directly equivalent to a conversion privilege. For example, each share of American and Foreign Power Second Preferred was issued with warrants to buy 4 shares of common at $25 per share. Instead of paying cash, the holder can tender preferred stock at a value of $100 per share. If he does so, he is actually converting his preferred stock with warrants into common. Similarly, the Rand Cardex 5.5% bonds, described in Chapter 22, could be tendered at par in lieu of cash upon exercising the warrants. Since the warrants attached to a $1,000 bond called for a payment of $900, 22.5 shares at 40, the owner of a $1,000 bond making payment in this fashion would have a $100 bond remaining. These provisions were thus equivalent to convertibility of 90% of each bond into common. More recent examples of this arrangement are Skull and Steel 6s and warrants and Commercial McKay Income 4s and warrants. Advantage of option to pay cash. The option to pay cash instead of turning in the senior issue must be considered an advantage over a straight conversion privilege. First, because the bond or preferred X warrants may be worth more than par, thus increasing the profit. Second, because, as previously explained, the holder may be glad to retain his investment while realizing a cash profit on its speculative component. And third, because the warrant is likely to sell separately at a greater premium over its realizable value than a pure convertible. All these advantages are illustrated by the Mohawk Hudson Power Corporation's second preferred with warrants. This stock was tenderable at par in lieu of cash upon exercise of the warrants, thus having rights equivalent to convertibility, but the warrant arrangement proved far more profitable than an equivalent conversion privilege. Detachability. Stock purchase warrants are either detachable, non-detachable, or non-detachable for a certain period and detachable thereafter. A detachable warrant may be exercised upon presentation of the warrant alone. Hence, it may be sold separately from the issue of which it originally formed a part. A non-detachable warrant or right may be exercised only in conjunction with the senior issue. That is, the bond or preferred stock must be physically presented at the time of making payment for the common shares. Hence, such warrants may not be dealt in separately. For example, the warrants attached to Montecatini 7s due 1937 and those accompanying the Fiat debenture 7s due 1946 were detachable immediately after issuance. Those attached to Lowe's, Inc. $6.50 preferred offered in December 1927 were not detachable until July 1, 1928, and the warrants attached to the Lowe's, Inc. 6% debentures due 1941 were not detachable until October 1, 1926, also 6 months after their issuance. On the other hand, the warrants attached to Crown Zellerbach Corporation debenture 6s due 1940 and to Interstate Department Stores, Inc. 7% preferred were not detachable during the life of the warrant unless the senior issue to which they were attached were called for redemption. In an active stock market, separate option warrants are popular with speculators, as pointed out before, and they sell at considerable premiums above their immediately realizable value. Other things being equal, therefore, an issue with detachable warrants will sell higher than one with a non-separable right. In view of this fact, it may be asked why all subscription warrants are not made immediately detachable to give the holder the benefit of their superior market appeal. The reason for making a warrant non-detachable is that both the company and the underwriters of the issue wish to avoid the establishment of an unduly low price for its bonds ex warrants. Such a low price is likely to follow if large purchases of the bond with warrants are made by out-and-out speculators. For these holders, having no interest in the bond as such, are likely to detach the warrant and sell the bond ex warrants for whatever it will bring. Selling pressure from this source, coupled with the absence of any steady demand for the issue due to lack of seasoning, may result in so low a price as to constitute an apparent reflection upon the corporation's credit, which is evidently undesirable. The compromise arrangement, which makes the warrant detachable only after an interval, is based upon the assumption that, after the security has had time to become fairly well known in the investment world, a proper price may more readily be established for the issue ex warrants, even in the face of sales by those who have profited from the warrants. When once these subscription warrants were made detachable from the related senior issue, they were bound to assume an existence and characteristics of their own. From a mere appendage of bond financing, they developed into an independent form of security and a major vehicle of speculation during the madness of 1928 to 1929. It is an amazing fact that the option warrants created by one company, American and Foreign Power, reached an indicated market value in 1929 of over $1 billion, a figure that exceeded the market value of all the railroad common stocks of the United States listed on the New York Stock Exchange in July 1932, less than 3 years later. It will be necessary, therefore, to consider in a later chapter the characteristics of stock purchase warrants viewed as an independent speculative medium. At that time, we shall discuss the relationships between the prices of such warrants and of the preferred and common shares of the same corporations. Participating issues. Most of the traits of this type of privilege have already been brought out in the preceding comparison with the other forms. A distinction may be made between two kinds of participation. The more usual arrangement depends upon the dividend paid upon the common. Less frequently, the profit sharing is determined by the earnings without reference to the dividend rate. Examples: Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company Preferred, already described, is a standard example of the first type. Budd Wheel Company Preferred illustrates the second. In the latter case, the basic dividend is 7% cumulative, but this rate increases to 8, 9, and 10%, according as the net earnings of the previous year exceed $600,000, $800,000, and $1 million, respectively. Celanese Corporation participating first preferred and Celluloid Corporation participating second preferred are each entitled to a basic 7% plus 10% of the earnings otherwise available for the common stock. Preferred shares constitute the great bulk of participating issues. Participating bonds are rare and likely to deviate widely in other respects from the standard bond pattern. The Kruger and Toll participating debentures, for example, although nominally a bond, were in essence a non-voting common stock. The Green Bay and Western Railway participating debentures, Series A and Series B, are in reality preferred and common stocks respectively. Spanish River Pulp and Paper Mills Limited, first sixes due 1931, but redeemed in 1928, are one of the few examples of an investment-type bond with a participating privilege. Siemens & Halske AG, a German enterprise, issued a series of participating debentures due 2930, carrying interest equal to the rate of dividend paid upon the common stock, but not less than 6%. Participating preferred stocks originally had a standard pattern, exemplified by Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company Preferred. The order of payment is first a fixed preference to the senior shares, then a similar amount on the common shares, and finally an equal participation share for share in additional dividends. This pattern arose from the common law right of all classes of stock to share equally in earnings and assets, except as otherwise provided by agreement. Other examples of this arrangement are Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul and Pacific Railroad Company Preferred, Wabash Railway Company 5% Preferred, A, Consolidated Film Industries Inc. Preferred. In recent years, however, a wide diversity of participating arrangements have made their appearance so that there is now no standard pattern. Participating issues require two kinds of calculation. One showing the number of times the fixed interest or dividend is earned, and the other showing the amount per share or per bond available for distribution under the participation privilege. Privileged issues compared with the related common stocks. In our previous discussion of the merits of privileged issues as a class, it was pointed out that they sometimes offer a very attractive combination of security and chance for profit. More frequently, a decision may be reached that the privileged senior security is preferable to the common stock of the enterprise. Since a conclusion of this kind is based on comparative elements only, it is likely to involve smaller risks of error than one that asserts the absolute attractiveness of an issue. Examples: Paramount Pictures Corporation's $6 first preferred is convertible at any time into 7 shares of common. Towards the end of 1936, it was selling at just about 7 times the price of the common, although it carried accumulated dividends of nearly $12 per share, which of course would have to be paid before the common could receive anything. For example, on October 17, 1936, the preferred sold at $1.13 against 15 7/8 for the common. Clearly, a switch from the common into the preferred would have been a wise move. The preferred stock could not be worth less than 7 times the price of the common. It might sell at more than this ratio, especially if the common declined in price. It was certain to receive substantial dividends before anything was disbursed on the common. The sequel promptly bore out this analysis. In December 1936, back dividends of $12 per share were paid on the preferred. In November 1937, the preferred sold at 92 1/4 versus only 10 1/4 for the common, showing a spread of 20.5 points. Including $4.50 of additional dividends paid on the preferred up to that time, the aggregate advantage accruing to the preferred stock as against the common amounted to fully $35 per share of preferred. A virtually identical situation existed in Studebaker Corporation 3, 6% debentures due 1945, and the common stock in 1936. The bonds were convertible into 80 shares of common. They carried 3% fixed interest and 3% cumulative contingent interest, of which 5 5/8% had accrued by November 18th. Yet their price was $1.20.5, practically on a parity with the price of $15 for the common. Less than a year later, the bonds sold at 59 3/4 against only 3 for the common, a spread, or profit, on the exchange of 35 1/4 points, exclusive of 3% fixed interest received on the bonds. Parity, premium, and discount. When the price of a convertible bond or preferred is exactly equivalent on an exchange basis to the current price of the common stock, the two issues are said to be selling at a parity. When the price of the senior issue is above parity, it is said to be selling at a premium, and the difference between its price and conversion parity is called the amount of the premium or the spread. Conversely, if the price of the convertible is below parity, the difference is sometimes called the discount. A fruitful field for dependable analysis. The Paramount and Studebaker examples give us that infrequent phenomenon, an absolutely dependable conclusion arrived at by security analysis. Holders of the common could not possibly lose by exchanging into the convertible issues, and they had excellent prospects, which in fact were realized, of deriving substantial benefits in the form of both increased income and greater market value. In this respect, privileged issues offer a fruitful field for the more scientific application of the technique of analysis. The foregoing examples are typical also of the price relationships created by an active and advancing market. When there is a senior issue convertible into common, the concentration of speculative interest in the latter often results in establishing a price level closely equivalent to and sometimes even higher than, the price of the senior issue, to which the public pays little attention. Conclusion from foregoing. It is clear that a convertible issue selling on a parity with the common is preferable thereto, except when its price is so far above an investment level that it has become merely a form of commitment in the common stock. Brooklyn Union Gas Company convertible 5.5s due 1936 are an example of the latter type of situation. The bonds, convertible into 20 shares of common from January 1, 1929, sold at $147 or higher during the years 1927 to 1932 inclusive, and sold at $489 in 1929. It is generally worthwhile to pay some moderate premium in order to obtain the superior safety of the senior issue. This is certainly true when the convertible yields a higher income return than the common, and it holds good to some extent even if the income yield is lower. Switching. As a practical rule, therefore, holders of common stocks who wish to retain their interest in the company should always exchange into a convertible senior issue of the enterprise whenever it sells both at an investment level on its own account and also close to parity on a conversion basis. Just how large a premium a common stockholder should be willing to pay in making such an exchange is a matter of individual judgment. Because of his confidence in the future of his company, he is usually unwilling to pay anything substantial for insurance against a decline in value. But experience shows that he would be wise to give up somewhat more than he thinks is necessary in order to secure the strategic advantages that even a fairly sound convertible issue possesses over a common stock. Hedging. These advantages of a strong convertible issue over a common stock become manifest when the market declines. The price of the senior issue will ordinarily suffer less severely than the common, so that a good-sized spread may thereby be established instead of the near parity previously existing. This possibility suggests a special form of market operation known as hedging, in which the operator buys the convertible and sells the common stock short against it at an approximate parity. In the event of a protracted rise, he can convert the senior issue and thus close out the transaction at only a slight loss, consisting of the original spread plus carrying expenses. But if the market declines substantially, he can undo the operation at a considerable profit by selling out the senior issue and buying back the common. A practical illustration of a hedging operation is afforded by Keith Albee Orpheum $7 preferred convertible at the time into 3 shares of Radio Keith Orpheum A, the hedge being established on March 1, 1929, and the positions reversed or undone on March 26, 1929, as may be seen in the accompanying PDF. The profit indicated was about 9% on the capital tied up in the transaction, and since it covered a period of 26 days, the profit was at the rate of over 100% per year. Since there was no chance of loss on the transaction, a considerable part of the cost of the preferred stock could properly have been borrowed, thus largely increasing the percentage of profit on the capital supplied by the operator. With favorable surrounding conditions, operations of this kind offer a chance for large gains against a small maximum loss. They are particularly suitable as a form of protection against other financial commitments, for they yield their profit in a declining market when other holdings are likely to show losses. Some technical aspects of hedging. Hedging has numerous technical aspects, however, which make it less simple and foolproof than our brief description would indicate. An exhaustive discussion of hedging would fall outside the scope of this volume, and for this reason we shall merely list below certain elements that the experienced hedger will take into account in embarking upon such operations. 1. Ability to borrow stock sold and to maintain short position indefinitely. 2. Original cost of establishing position, including spread and commissions. 3. Cost of maintaining the position, including interest charges on long holdings, dividends on short stock, possible premiums payable for borrowing stock, and stamp taxes in connection with reborrowings of stock, less offsets in the forms of dividends or interest receivable on long securities, and possible interest credit on short position. 4. Amount of profit at which operation will probably be closed out if opportunity offers. Relationship between this maximum profit and probable maximum loss consisting of 2 plus 3. It should be borne in mind in these, as in all other operations in securities, that the potential profit to be taken into account is not the maximum figure that might conceivably be reached in the market, but merely the highest figure for which the operator is likely to wait before he closes out his position. Once a given profit is taken, the additional profit that might have been realized subsequently becomes of merely academic interest. An intermediate form of hedging. An intermediate form of hedging consists of purchasing a convertible issue and selling only part of the related common shares, say 1/2 of the amount receivable upon conversion. On this basis, a profit may be realized in the event of either a substantial advance or a substantial decline in the common stock. This is probably the most scientific method of hedging, since it requires no opinion as to the future course of prices. An ideal situation of this kind would meet the following 2 requirements. 1. A strongly entrenched senior issue that can be relied on to maintain a price close to par even if the common should drop precipitately. A good convertible bond maturing in a short time is an ideal type for this purpose. 2. A common stock in which the speculative interest is large and that is therefore subject to wide fluctuations in either direction. An example of this form of hedge is supplied by operations carried on in 1918 to 1919 in Pierce Oil 6s due in 1920 and the company's common stock. The advantages possessed by convertibles along the lines just described are shared also by participating and purchase warrant issues. The latter types of privileged securities may, of course, be used as media for hedging operations. Similarly, it may be found most desirable to switch from common stocks into such issues. The Rand Cardex 5 1/2s previously described were not only an attractive direct commitment at the time of issuance, but they were certainly a desirable substitute for the Class A stock. Furthermore, they offered an interesting hedging opportunity. In like manner, persons committed to a permanent investment in Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company would certainly have been wise to switch from the common stock into the participating preferred when the latter sold at a lower price than the common in 1929 or 1930. In this case, however, a hedging operation between the preferred and common would have involved special hazards, because the senior issue was not convertible into the junior shares. Chapter 26. Senior Securities of Questionable Safety. At the low point of the 1932 securities market, the safety of at least 80% of all corporate bonds and preferred stocks was open to some appreciable degree of doubt. Even prior to the 1929 crash, the number of speculative senior securities was very large, and it must inevitably be still larger for some years to come. The financial world is faced, therefore, with the unpleasant fact that a considerable proportion of American securities belong to what may be called a misfit category. A low-grade bond or preferred stock constitutes a relatively unpopular form of commitment. The investor must not buy them, and the speculator generally prefers to devote his attention to common stocks. There seems to be much logic to the view that if one decides to speculate, he should choose a thoroughly speculative medium and not subject himself to the upper limitations of market value and income return, or to the possibility of confusion between speculation and investment, which attach to the lower-priced bonds and preferred stocks. Limitation of profit on low-priced bonds not a real drawback. But however impressive may be the objection to these nondescript securities, the fact remains that they exist in enormous quantities, that they are owned by innumerable security holders, and that hence they must be taken seriously into account in any survey of security analysis. It is reasonable to conclude that the large supply of such issues, coupled with the lack of a natural demand for them, will make for a level of prices below their intrinsic value. Even if an inherent unattractiveness in the form of such securities be admitted, this may be more than offset by the attractive price at which they may be purchased. Furthermore, the limitations of principal profit in the case of a low-priced bond, as compared with a common stock, may be of only minor practical importance because the profit actually realized by the common stock buyer is ordinarily no greater than that obtainable from a speculative senior security. If, for example, we are considering a 4% bond selling at 35, its maximum possible price appreciation is about 70 points or 200%. The average common stock purchase at 35 cannot be held for a greater profit than this without a dangerous surrender to bull market psychology. Two viewpoints with respect to speculative bonds. There are two directly opposite angles from which a speculative bond may be viewed. It may be considered in its relation to investment standards and yields, in which case the leading question is whether or not the low price and higher income return will compensate for the concession made in the safety factor. Or it may be thought of in terms of a common stock commitment, in which event the contrary question arises, viz., does the smaller risk of loss involved in this low-priced bond as compared with a common stock compensate for the smaller possibilities of profit? The nearer a bond comes to meeting investment requirements and the closer it sells to an investment price, the more likely are those interested to regard it from the investment viewpoint. The opposite approach is evidently suggested in the case of a bond in default or selling at an extremely low price. We are faced here with the familiar difficulty of classification arising from the absence of definite lines of demarcation. Some issues can always be found reflecting any conceivable status in the gamut between complete worthlessness and absolute safety. Common stock approach preferable. We believe, however, that the sounder and more fruitful approach to the field of speculative senior securities lies from the direction of common stocks. This will carry with it a more thorough appreciation of the risk involved and therefore a greater insistence upon either reasonable assurance of safety or especially attractive possibilities of profit or both. It induces also, among intelligent security buyers at least, a more intensive examination of the corporate picture than would ordinarily be made in viewing a security from the investment angle. Such an approach would be distinctly unfavorable to the purchase of slightly substandard bonds selling at moderate discounts from par. These, together with high coupon bonds of second grade, belong in the category of businessmen's investments, which we considered and decided against in Chapter 7. It may be objected that a general adoption of this attitude would result in wide and sudden fluctuations in the price of many issues. Assuming that a 4% bond deserves to sell at par as long as it meets strict investment standards, then as soon as it falls slightly below these standards, its price would suffer a precipitous decline, say to 70, and conversely a slight improvement in its exhibit would warrant its jumping suddenly back to par. Apparently, there would be no justification for intermediate quotations between 70 and 100. The real situation is not so simple as this, however. Differences of opinion may properly exist in the minds of investors as to whether or not a given issue is adequately secured, particularly since the standards are qualitative and personal as well as arithmetical and objective. The range between 70 and 100 may therefore logically reflect a greater or lesser agreement concerning the safety of the issue. This would mean that an investor would be justified in buying such a bond, say, at 85, if his own considered judgment regarded it as sound, although he would recognize that there was doubt on this score in the minds of other investors that would account for its appreciable discount from a prime investment price. According to this view, the levels between 70 and 100, approximately, may be designated as the range of subjective variations in the status of the issue. The field of speculative values proper would therefore commence somewhere near the 70 level for bonds with a coupon rate of 4% or larger, and would offer maximum possibilities of appreciation of at least 50% of the cost. In the case of other senior issues, 70% of normal value might be taken as the dividing line. In making such commitments, it is recommended that the same general attitude be taken as in the careful purchase of a common stock. In other words, that the income account and the balance sheet be submitted to the same intensive analysis, and that the same effort be made to evaluate future possibilities, favorable and unfavorable. Important distinctions between common stocks and speculative senior issues. We shall not seek, therefore, to set up standards of selection for speculative senior issues in any sense corresponding to the quantitative tests applicable to fixed-value securities. On the other hand, although they should preferably be considered in their relationship to the common stock approach and technique, it is necessary to appreciate certain rather important points of difference that exist between common stocks as a class and speculative senior issues. Low-priced bonds associated with corporate weakness. The limitation on the profit possibilities of senior securities has already been referred to. Its significance varies with the individual case, but in general we do not consider it a controlling disadvantage. A more emphatic objection is made against low-priced bonds and preferred stocks on the ground that they are associated with corporate weakness, retrogression, or depression. Obviously, the enterprise behind such a security is not highly successful, and furthermore, it must have been following a downward course since the issue originally sold at a much higher level. In 1928 and 1929, this consideration was enough to condemn all such issues absolutely in the eyes of the general public. Businesses were divided into two groups, those which were successful and progressing, and those which were on the downgrade or making no headway. The common shares of the first group were desirable no matter how high the price, but no security belonging to the second group was attractive, irrespective of how low it sold. This concept of permanently strong and permanently weak corporations has been pretty well dissipated by the subsequent depression, and we are back to the older realization that time brings unpredictable changes in the fortunes of business undertakings. The fact that the low price of a bond or preferred stock results from a decline in earnings need not signify that the company's outlook is hopeless and that there is nothing ahead but still poorer results. Many of the companies that fared very badly in 1931 to 1933 regained a good part of their former earning power, and their senior securities recovered from exceedingly low prices to investment levels. It turned out, therefore, that there was just as much reason to expect substantial recoveries in the quotations of depressed senior securities as in the price of common stocks generally. Many undervalued in relation to their status and contractual position. We have already mentioned that the unpopularity of speculative senior securities tends to make them sell at lower prices than common stocks in relation to their intrinsic value. From the standpoint of the intelligent buyer, this must be considered a point in their favor. With respect to their intrinsic position, speculative bonds, and to a lesser degree preferred stocks, derive important advantages from their contractual rights. The fixed obligation to pay bond interest will usually result in the continuation of such payments as long as they are in any way possible. If we assume that a fairly large proportion of a group of carefully selected low-priced bonds will escape default, the income received on the group as a whole over a period of time will undoubtedly far exceed the dividend return on similarly priced common stocks. Preferred shares occupy an immeasurably weaker position in this regard. But even here, the provisions transferring voting control to the senior shares in the event of suspension of dividends will be found in some cases to impel their continuance. Where the cash resources are ample, the desire to maintain an unbroken record and to avoid accumulations will frequently result in paying preferred dividends even though poor earnings have depressed the market price. Examples: Century Ribbon Mills, Inc. failed to earn its 7% preferred dividend in 8 out of the 13 years from 1926 to 1938 inclusive, and the price repeatedly declined to about 50. Yet the preferred dividend was continued without interruption during this entire period, while the common received a total of but 50 cents. Similarly, a purchaser of Universal Pictures Company First Preferred at about 30 in 1929 would have received the 8% dividend during 3 years of depression before the payment was finally suspended. Contrasting importance of contractual terms in speculation and investment. The reader should appreciate the distinction between the investment and the speculative qualities of preferred stocks in this matter of dividend continuance. From the investment standpoint, that is, the dependability of the dividend, the absence of an enforceable claim is a disadvantage as compared with bonds. From the speculative standpoint, that is, the possibility of dividends being continued under unfavorable conditions, preferred stocks have certain semi-contractual claims to consideration by the directors that undoubtedly give them an advantage over common stocks. Bearing of working capital and sinking fund factors on safety of speculative senior issues. A large working capital, which has been characteristic of even non-prosperous industrials for some years past, is much more directly advantageous to the senior securities than to the common stock. Not only does it make possible the continuance of interest or preferred dividend payments, but it has an important bearing also on the retirement of the principal, either at maturity or by sinking fund operations or by voluntary repurchase. Sinking fund provisions for bonds as well as preferred stocks contribute to the improvement of both the market quotation and the intrinsic position of the issue. This advantage is not found in the case of common stocks. Examples: Francis H. Leggett Company, manufacturers and wholesalers of food products, issued $2 million of 7% preferred stock carrying a sinking fund provision which retired 3% of the issue annually. By June 30, 1932, the amount outstanding had been reduced to $608,500, and because of the small balance remaining, the issue was called for redemption at 110 in the depth of the Depression. Similarly, Century Ribbon Mills Preferred was reduced from $2 million to $544,000 between 1922 and 1938, and Lawrence Portland Cement Company debenture 5.5s were reduced from $2 million to $650,000 on December 31, 1938, the balance being called for redemption on April 1, 1939. Importance of large net current asset coverage. Where a low-priced bond is covered several times over by net current assets, it presents a special type of opportunity because experience shows that the chances of repayment are good even though the earnings may be poor or irregular. Examples: Electric Refrigeration Corporation, Kelvinator, 6s, due 1936, sold at 66 in November 1929 when the net current assets of the company, according to its latest statement, amounted to $6,008,900 for the $2,528,500 of bonds outstanding. It is true that the company had operated at a deficit in 1927 and 1928, but fixed charges were earned nearly 9 times in the year ended September 30, 1929, and the net current assets were nearly 4 times the market value of the bond issue. The bonds recovered to a price close to par in 1930 and were redeemed at 105 in 1931. Similarly, Electric Refrigeration Building Corporation First 6s due 1936, which were in effect guaranteed by Kelvinator Corporation under a lease, sold at 70 in July 1932 when the net current assets of the parent company amounted to about 6 times the $1,073,000 of bonds outstanding, and over 8 times the total market value of the issue. The bonds were called at 101.5 in 1933. Other examples that may be cited in this connection are Murray Corporation First 6.5s, due 1934, which sold at 68 in 1932 because of current operating deficits, although the company had net current assets of over 2.5 times the par value of the issue and nearly 4 times their market value at that price. Sidney Blumenthal and Company 7% notes, due 1936, which sold at 70 in 1926 when the company had net current assets of twice the par value of the issue and nearly 3 times the total market value thereof. They were called at 103 in 1930. Belding Hemingway Company 6s, due 1936, which sold at 67 in 1930 when the company had net current assets of nearly 3 times the par value of the issue and over 4 times its market value. In the latter case, drastic liquidation of inventories occurred in 1930 and 1931, proceeds from which were used to retire about 80% of the bond issue through purchases in the market. The balance of the issue was called for payment at 101 early in 1934. In the typical case of this kind, the chance of profit will exceed the chance of loss, and the probable amount of profit will exceed the probable amount of loss. It may well be that the risk involved in each individual case is still so considerable as to preclude us from applying the term investment to such a commitment. Nevertheless, we suggest that if the insurance principle of diversification of risk be followed by making a number of such commitments at the same time, the net result should be sufficiently dependable to warrant our calling the group purchase an investment operation. This was one of the possibilities envisaged in our broadened definition of investment as given in Chapter 4. Limitations upon importance of current asset position. It is clear that considerable weight attaches to the working capital exhibit in selecting speculative bonds. This importance must not be exaggerated, however, to the point of assuming that, whenever a bond is fully covered by net current assets, its safety is thereby assured. The current assets shown in any balance sheet may be greatly reduced by subsequent operating losses. More important still, the stated values frequently prove entirely undependable in the event of insolvency. Of the many examples of this point which can be given, we shall mention R. Hoe and Company 7% notes and Ajax Rubber Company First Eights. Although these obligations were covered by net working capital in 1929, they subsequently sold as low as 2 cents on the dollar. We must distinguish, therefore, between the mere fact that the working capital, as reported, covers the funded debt and the more significant fact that it exceeds the bond issue many times over. The former statement is always interesting, but by no means conclusive. If added to other favorable factors, such as a good earnings coverage in normal years and a generally satisfactory qualitative showing, it might make the issue quite attractive, but preferably as part of a group purchase in the field. Speculative preferred stocks. Stages in their price history. Speculative preferred stocks are more subject than speculative bonds to irrational activity, so that from time to time such preferred shares are overvalued in the market in the same way as common stocks. We thus have 3 possible stages in the price history of a preferred issue, in each of which the market quotation tends to be out of line with the value. 1. The first stage is that of original issuance, when investors are persuaded to buy the offering at a full investment price not justified by its intrinsic merit. 2. In the second stage, the lack of investment merit has become manifest and the price drops to a speculative level. During this period, the decline is likely to be overdone for reasons previously discussed. 3. A third stage sometimes appears in which the issue advances speculatively in the same fashion as common stocks. On such occasions, certain factors of questionable importance, such as the amount of dividend accumulations, are overemphasized. An example of this third or irrational stage will be given a little later. The rule of maximum valuation for senior issues. Both as a safeguard against being led astray by the propaganda that is characteristic of the third stage, and also as a general guide in dealing with speculative senior issues, the following principle of security analysis is presented, which we shall call the rule of maximum valuation for senior issues. A senior issue cannot be worth intrinsically any more than a common stock would be worth if it occupied the position of that senior issue with no junior securities outstanding. This statement may be understood more readily by means of an example. Company X and Company Y have the same value. Company X has 80,000 shares of preferred and 200,000 shares of common. Company Y has only 80,000 shares of common and no preferred. Then our principle states that a share of Company X preferred cannot be worth more than a share of Company Y common. This is true because Company Y common represents the same value that lies behind both the preferred and common of Company X. Instead of comparing two equivalent companies such as X and Y, we may assume that Company X is recapitalized so that the old common is eliminated and the preferred becomes the sole stock issue, that is, the new common stock. To coin a term, we may call such an assumed change the communizing of a preferred stock. Then our principle merely states the obvious fact that the value of such a hypothetical common stock cannot be less than the value of the preferred stock it replaces, because it is equivalent to the preferred plus the old common. The same idea may be applied to a speculative bond followed either by common stock only or by both preferred and common. If the bond is commonized, that is, if it is assumed to be turned into a common stock, with the old stock issues eliminated, then the value of the new common stock thus created cannot be less than the present value of the bond. This relationship must hold true regardless of how high the coupon or dividend rate, the par value, or the redemption price of the senior issue may be, and, particularly, regardless of what amount of unpaid interest or dividends may have accumulated. For if we had a preferred stock with accumulations of $1,000 per share, the value of the issue could be no greater than if it were a common stock, without dividend accumulations, representing complete ownership of the business. The unpaid dividends cannot create any additional value for the company's securities in the aggregate. They merely affect the division of the total value between the preferred and the common. Excessive emphasis placed on amount of accrued dividends. Although a very small amount of analysis will show the above statements to be almost self-evident truths, the public fails to observe the simplest rules of logic when once it is in a gambling mood. Hence, preferred shares with large dividend accruals have lent themselves readily to market manipulation in which the accumulations are made the basis for a large advance in the price of both the preferred and the common. An excellent example of such a performance was provided by American Zinc, Lead, and Smelting Company shares in 1928. American Zinc preferred stock was created in 1916 as a stock dividend on the common, the transaction thus amounting to a split-up of old common into preferred and new common. The preferred was given a stated par of $25 but had all the attributes of a $100 par stock. $6 cumulative dividends, redemption, and liquidating value of $100. This arrangement was evidently a device to permit carrying the preferred issue in the balance sheet as a much smaller liability than it actually represented. Between 1920 and 1927, the company reported continuous deficits, except for a negligible profit in 1922. Preferred dividends were suspended in 1921, and by 1928 about $40 per share had accumulated. In 1928, the company benefited moderately from the prevailing prosperity and barely earned $6 per share on the preferred. However, the company's issues were subjected to manipulation that advanced the price of the preferred from $35 in 1927 to $118 in 1928, while the common rose even more spectacularly from $6 to $57. These advances were accompanied by rumors of a plan to pay off the accumulated dividends, exactly how not being stated. Naturally enough, this development failed to materialize. The irrationality of the gambling spirit is well shown here by the absurd acceptance of unpaid preferred dividends as a source of value for both the preferred and the common. The speculative argument in behalf of the common stock ran as follows. The accumulated preferred dividends are going to be paid off. This will be good for the common. Therefore, let us buy the common. According to this topsy-turvy reasoning, if there were no unpaid preferred dividends ahead of the common, it would be less attractive, even at the same price, because there would then be in prospect no wonderful plan for clearing up the accumulations. We may use the American Zinc example to demonstrate the practical application of our rule of maximum valuation for senior issues. Was American Zinc preferred too high at 118 in 1928? Assuming the preferred stockholders owned the company completely, this would then mean a price of $118 for a common stock, earning $6 per share in 1928 after 8 years of deficits. Even in the hectic days of 1928, speculators would not have been at all attracted to such a common stock at that price, so that the application of our rule should have prevented the purchase of the preferred stock at its inflated value. The quotation of 57 reached by American Zinc Common was evidently the height of absurdity, since it represented the following valuation for the company. Preferred stock 80,000 shares at 118, $9,440,000. Common stock 200,000 shares at 57, $11,400,000. Total valuation $20,840,000. Earnings 1928, $481,000. Average earnings 1920 to 1927, $188,000 deficit. In order to equal the above valuation for the American Zinc Company, the hypothetical common stock, 80,000 shares basis, would have had to sell at $260 per share, earning a bare $6 and paying no dividend. This figure indicates the extent to which the heedless public was led astray in this case by the exploitation of unpaid dividends. American Hide and Leather Company offers another but less striking example of this point. In no year between 1922 and 1928 inclusive did the company earn more than $4.41 on the preferred, and the average profits were very small. Yet in each of these 7 years, the preferred stock sold as high as 66 or higher. This recurring strength was based largely on the speculative appeal of the enormous accumulated preferred dividends, which grew from about $120 to $175 per share during this period. Applying our rule, we may consider American Hide and Leather Preferred as representing complete ownership of the business, which to all intents and purposes it did. We should then have a common stock which had paid no dividends for many years and with average earnings at best, using the 1922 to 1927 period, of barely $2 per share. Evidently, a price of above $65 for such a common stock would be far too high. Consequently, this price was excessive for American Hide and Leather Preferred, nor could the existence of accumulated dividends, however large, affect this conclusion in the slightest. Variation in capital structure affects total market value of securities. From the foregoing discussion, it might be inferred that the value of a single capital stock issue must always be equivalent to the combined values of any preferred and common stock issues into which it might be split. In a theoretical sense, this is entirely true, but in practice it may not be true at all, because a division of capitalization into senior securities and common stock may have a real advantage over a single common stock issue. This subject will receive extended treatment under the heading of Capitalization Structure in Chapter 40. The distinction between the idea just suggested and our rule of maximum valuation may be clarified as follows. 1. Assume Company X equals Company Y. 2. Company X has preferred, P, and common, C. Company Y has common only, C prime. 3. Then it would appear that value of P plus value of C equals value of C prime, since each side of the equation represents equal things, namely the total value of each company. But this apparent relationship may not hold good in practice because the preferred and common capitalization method may have real advantages over a single common stock issue. On the other hand, our rule of maximum valuation merely states that the value of P alone cannot exceed the value of C prime. This should hold true in practice as well as in theory, except in so far as manipulative or heedlessly speculative activity brushes aside all rational considerations. Our rule is stated in negative form and is therefore essentially negative in its application. It is most useful in detecting instances where preferred stocks or bonds are not worth their market price. To apply it positively, it would be necessary first to arrive at a value for the preferred on a communized basis, that is, representing complete ownership of the business, and then to determine what deduction from this value should be made to reflect the part of the ownership fairly ascribable to the existing common stock. At times, this approach will be found useful in establishing the fact that a given senior issue is worth more than its market price. But such a procedure brings us far outside the range of mathematical formulas and into the difficult and indefinite field of common stock valuation with which we have next to deal. Part 4. Theory of Common Stock Investment, the Dividend Factor. Introduction to Part 4, Finding Value in Common Stocks, by Todd Combs. Some 9 decades after Graham and Dodd's security analysis was first published, many, if not most, of the principles it laid out still hold true. Certainly, the need to perform thorough analysis of potential investments and the importance of downside protection resonate as much with me now as when I read security analysis the first time many years ago. Given the authors were writing only a few years removed from the 1929 crash and in the middle of the Great Depression, their approach to investing was completely understandable. Investing, according to Graham and Dodd, could be considered a negative art, focused more on downside protection than on the pursuit of upside. When done well, investing involves learning how to process information in order to determine when the odds are in your favor. The goal is to make educated bets based on facts and not stories. In investing, and in life for that matter, you can't choose outcomes, but you can choose the decisions that may get you the outcomes you want. With timeless wisdom like this, security analysis retains its relevance and, indeed, has been an invaluable pillar of my career. Security analysis was published during the latter stages of the Industrial Revolution, a time when the great businesses of the day were massively capital-intensive endeavors. Maintaining plant and equipment required significant capital spending, and growing a business necessitated still more, the end result being low returns on invested capital compared to today's largest enterprises. The world of business and investment has changed significantly over the past century, and many of today's largest companies have only a limited amount invested in tangible assets, yet extraordinary cash generation capability. In many cases, their primary assets are people, intellectual property, and brands. There are no assembly lines or blast furnaces, no locomotives or steam shovels. Profit margins for such businesses are far above those of the typical asset-heavy firms from generations past. The value of a contemporary company is consequently less bound up with the value of its physical assets. This may require us to tilt the prism of analysis to adjust to today's reality, but the original concepts put forward by Graham and Dodd remain the same. 1. That imprecise but reasonably accurate intrinsic values can be determined through careful assessment and analysis of earnings power, and 2. There are investment opportunities to be had in purchasing shares of a company at a price below these intrinsic values. But what does it take these days to determine a company's intrinsic value? We will work our way to the answer. Lessons learned. Investing in equities has been described as simple but not easy. Concepts such as don't overpay, identify good management teams, avoid speculation, be patient, verify the accuracy of financial statements, the market is a voting machine and not a weighing machine, and focus on qualitative as well as quantitative aspects of a business are all bandied about, but they are easier to invoke in principle than in practice. In attempting to value companies over my career, I've come to appreciate that the difference between a good analyst and a great one lies in the ability to keep things simple and determine what matters most. People misinterpret this to mean that investors should keep things at the surface level. In fact, it paradoxically takes a great deal of depth to stay simple. The analyst's job is to tear apart an investment in order to understand its essential elements. A great security analyst is willing to rip a company down to its studs and understand each part before they reassemble it. In the massive sea of information that an analyst is continuously ingesting, there's always one piece that matters more than the others. Finding that morsel is what keeping it simple means. An example that stands out most in my mind dates back to 2002. I was a young analyst attending a payments conference, and I was looking at MasterCard for the first time. Although it was still a private company, management was nevertheless presenting on the company, which intrigued me. Perhaps because it was private and therefore not offering a clear way to invest in or profit from researching it, only a few of us were on hand for the presentation. I continued to follow the company closely and felt I understood it well by the time it came public in the spring of 2006. The company was being brought public to fund a large legal settlement. The Wall Street narrative at the time of MasterCard's IPO was that the company did not have pricing power. Surely, bank consolidation was destined to squeeze its margins, but we saw things differently. There were several key qualitative considerations in my MasterCard analysis. For example, as banks benefited from higher interchange revenues, their incentives were actually aligned with MasterCard's, and long-term pricing power was likely to remain strong. We believed growth would continue for a long time as credit cards continued to replace cash, and having publicly traded shares rather than being owned by banks facilitated creation of an incentive structure for management, just as in many past demutualizations of insurance companies and other customer-owned companies, to run a tight ship. Also, many of the apparent risks seemed overstated. Banking industry consolidation was far from certain to continue unabated. Also, legal risks facing the company seemed likely to be resolved without significant impairment. Investors must always remember that a spreadsheet, no matter how good, is not business reality. The numbers laid out in a spreadsheet tell a precise story, but sometimes it's not the right story. For example, overemphasis of the quantitative can lead to missing the qualitative and vice versa. In the end, assessing both can be very valuable. Because finding simplicity can be complicated, I break down my process into 3 buckets. Find a good business with good management at a good valuation. You don't need or expect to find all 3 of these to the same degree in every investment. There can be a sliding scale with puts and takes. Nonetheless, all 3 must be present. Think of it as a multiplicative series where a 0 in any of the cells will yield a 0 overall regardless of how high the other elements may rate. Keeping it simple, Principle 1, finding a good business. The question I'm asked most often is what exactly constitutes a good business? The short answer begins with having a competitive advantage, or what Warren Buffett calls a moat. The wider the moat, the better. Add-on characteristics like low capital intensity, pricing power, recurring revenues, staying power, and the likelihood of long-term growth, and you have a great business. In determining if a business is great, I like to start on the quantitative side. I focus